On the 365th day, the 20th broken car was dropped onto Silas Rowe's property like a final insult. Victoria Blackthorne stood beside the transport truck, watching the single father she had turned into the town's quiet joke, certain this graveyard of wreckage would force him to sell before the bank took everything. Silas did not argue or raise his voice. He wiped the dust from a silver emblem that had vanished from American history and signed the delivery receipt. 2 weeks later, at a closed-door auction, the final bid crossed $20 million. When the hammer fell, Victoria finally understood she had spent an entire year delivering a fortune to the one man she had never thought to respect. Stay until the end to find out exactly how Silas Rowe turned one CEO's calculated cruelty into the most stunning reversal Briar Glen had ever seen. The Blackthorne transport truck rolled through the gate of Silas Rowe's property at just past 9 in the morning, its hydraulics hissing as it backed toward the last remaining patch of open concrete. Behind it, suspended on a flatbed and covered by a gray tarp, was a coupe. Rear panels streaked with rust, 2 tires flat, the whole silhouette sagging the way something sags when it has been stored without care for decades. Victoria Blackthorne arrived in a separate car, black and polished, stepping out in a structured charcoal jacket that looked entirely out of place against the landscape of aging metal surrounding her. She had dressed deliberately. This was not a business visit. It was a ceremony. Along both sides of the access road, a handful of neighbors had gathered near their fence posts, and 3 of Silas's former regular customers stood at a distance, not close enough to speak but near enough to watch. The way people watch the end of something they feel bad about but cannot look away from. 19 cars already occupied the property, some in rows, some pushed to the edges of the lot, all of them bearing the particular stillness of machines that had not run in a very long time. The workshop behind them was still operating technically, though the customer bay held only a single sedan waiting for a brake job that had been rescheduled twice. Silas stood near the loading ramp with his clipboard, dressed in the same gray work shirt he wore every morning, unhurried and entirely unreadable. Victoria walked toward him without greeting the neighbors, without acknowledging the small crowd at all, her attention fixed on the man who had, for the past year, refused every offer, every threat, and every act of pressure she had directed at him with the quiet steadiness of someone who simply did not need her approval to survive. She told him this was the final delivery, that the Blackthorne fleet clearance was now complete, and that after today there was no longer any reason for Silas to hold on to a piece of land that was costing him far more than it was worth. She told him the paperwork for the sale was still available, that her legal team could process it the same afternoon, and that what she was offering him was not defeat but a practical exit from a situation he had made unnecessarily complicated. Silas let her finish. He did not interrupt, did not shift his weight, did not do any of the things people do when they are unsettled by what they are hearing. When she was done, he asked one question. He asked whether the company was confirming that this delivery represented the complete inventory of vehicles covered under the storage agreement. Victoria said yes, the way people say things they consider beneath discussion. Silas asked her to confirm that in writing on the delivery receipt. Victoria reached for the clipboard. After she signed, the transport crew unloaded the coupe and the truck pulled away, and Victoria left without looking back, already on her phone, already moving forward in her mind to the next item on a schedule that had no room for a single mechanic in a small Pennsylvania town. Silas waited until every vehicle was gone from the road. Then he walked to the coupe, took hold of the tarp, and pulled it off in one slow movement. What appeared beneath the weathering and the grime was not simply an old car. Pressed into the front quarter panel, beneath 2 later coats of industrial primer, was a small silver badge in the shape of paired wings, and beneath those wings, in a font no production vehicle had ever used, were 2 words, Aurelius Atelier. Silas crouched and ran his thumb across the badge without cleaning it. The way you touch something you have been waiting to confirm was real. He opened the hood and found a copper plate bolted to the firewall behind the original intake manifold, stamped with a model designation and the Roman numerals for 20. The 20th car, the last in the series. Silas stood there a moment longer than necessary, then closed the hood and walked back to the workshop, where his daughter June was waiting in the doorway with her camera held loosely at her side. She asked if they finally had everything. Silas looked down the row of 20 cars standing in the afternoon light, then looked at his daughter and said that now they did. Inside the glove compartment of the coupe, wrapped in a cloth envelope tucked beneath the service manual, was a sealed letter bearing a wax stamp and a handwritten name in the upper corner, Edwin Aurelius. On the front of the envelope, in a different hand, someone had written a single instruction that had apparently gone unread by every person who had touched this car in the decades since. Do not allow this to reach Blackthorn. 1 year earlier, Silas Rowe was managing the particular kind of financial difficulty that does not announce itself all at once, but arrives in small, compounding increments that each seem survivable until the moment they are not. The bank holding his mortgage had sent a preliminary review notice. Not yet a threat, but not reassurance either. And the property tax increase tied to a new highway development corridor had arrived the same month that 2 of his oldest commercial accounts transferred their fleet maintenance contracts to a larger shop near the interstate. The roof above the storage section of the workshop had a soft patch that expanded every time it rained, and the supplier, who had extended him 60-day credit terms for most of a decade, had quietly reduced that window to 30 without a conversation. Silas had not told June any of this, not because he thought she was too young to understand, but because the land had been her grandfather's before it was his, and it had been the one fixed point in their lives since her mother died, and he did not want her to feel the way you feel when fixed points begin to move. Victoria Blackthorn arrived on a Tuesday in 3 vehicles, and everything about the visit was engineered to feel inevitable. She brought her offer documents in a folder embossed with the Blackthorn corporate seal, and she presented her case in the language of logic, citing the tax burden, the highway expansion, the declining foot traffic on that stretch of county road, and the figure she was prepared to put on paper that day, which was less than the land was worth, but more than the bank would extend Silas credit against. She said she was offering him an honest transaction and that her schedule did not allow her to revisit it at a later date. Silas read the first page of the offer, set it face down on the workbench, and told her no. Victoria increased the number. Silas told her the number was not the issue. Victoria told him that refusing a reasonable offer out of sentiment was not a business decision, it was a personal one, and personal decisions had consequences that sentiment could not absorb. She said it with a smile that was not unkind in its expression but was entirely absent of warmth. And then she said the line she had probably prepared on the drive over, that people often confused stubbornness with dignity. Silas told her that people with power often confused ownership with entitlement. The room held that for a moment. Victoria left without a second goodbye. The consequences arrived within weeks, each one deniable in isolation. The parts supplier reduced his credit line to 0, citing an internal risk review. The county zoning office scheduled a compliance inspection on the basis of a neighbor complaint. Silas could not trace to any actual neighbor. A contractor who had been sending referrals stopped returning messages. The bank requested additional collateral documentation ahead of schedule. None of it was a law being broken. All of it was a system being applied with precision. When Victoria returned the following month, she came with a different kind of proposal. Not a purchase, but a rental. Blackthorn Automotive was clearing a storage facility and needed a temporary holding site for a number of decommissioned vehicles, and she was prepared to pay a monthly fee that would cover roughly 2/3 of his mortgage payment. The subtext was not subtle. She expected him to refuse, fail, and eventually sell under duress. What she had not counted on was Silas reading the proposed contract with more care than her legal team had drafted it. He modified the addendum. He added language about abandoned property rights, lien procedures, and notification requirements. He set the fees and the timeline. Victoria's attorney reviewed it and flagged nothing of consequence because the vehicles the company intended to store had been assessed internally at negligible scrap value. Victoria signed. 3 days later, the first car arrived. When Silas pulled up the registration panel and found a chassis stamp that no production vehicle had ever carried, he opened his notebook and began writing down everything. Farned. 6 cars arrived in the first 3 months, and to anyone passing on the county road, they looked exactly like what Victoria intended them to look like. The accumulated wreckage of a company discarding things it no longer needed, deposited on the property of a man who could not afford to refuse the storage fee. The paint on most of them had been bleached or peeled to bare metal in sections. The glass on 2 was cracked. The interiors were dried leather and stripped hardware, and the engines were coated in the particular residue of oil that has not moved through a system in many years. Blackthorn's transport team positioned them near the road at the edge of the property, which was not accidental. Victoria had specified placement in her internal instructions. A local blogger posted a photograph of the lot, and within a week a name had attached itself to the property in the casual, repeated way that names attach when a community has already decided what it thinks. Silas's customer count dropped by 1/3 in the first 2 months. What Silas did not explain to anyone, not to the neighbors watching from the fence line and not to June until she asked directly, was what he had started finding when he examined each car closely after the transport crews were gone. The chassis were not stamped the way production vehicles are stamped. They were hand-engraved, each one with sequential numbers that ran in a series, and beneath the later layers of industrial primer, there were traces of a pale silver-gray paint formulation that did not match any Blackthorn production color, but appeared consistently across every car he had checked so far. The suspension components on the 3rd car used a geometry that Silas recognized from a journal article on mid-century prototype engineering, a design that had been theorized but never confirmed in any surviving vehicle. Several of the instrument clusters carried calibration markings that had no corresponding commercial application. The cars looked like junk from the road. Up close, underneath, they were something else entirely. Silas said nothing about this to anyone. He understood, with the precision of someone who had spent years assessing value in things others overlooked, that the moment Victoria Blackthorn understood what was sitting on his property, she would find a mechanism to retrieve it before he had completed the steps he needed to complete. He had spent 4 years doing restoration work for an auction house in Philadelphia before his wife's illness brought him back to Briar Glen, and in that time he had learned that the space between a car's apparent condition and its actual condition was almost always where the important truth lived. A vehicle that had been stored rather than driven aged differently than one that had been used and neglected. The corrosion patterns were different. The wear on the mechanical components was different, and the surface deterioration, while often more severe in appearance, concealed interiors and structural elements that could be remarkably intact. These cars had been stored. They had not been driven to their end. Someone, at some point in the decades they spent in that sealed warehouse section, had understood enough to keep moisture away from the critical components, even if nothing else had been done for them. June had started photographing the arrivals from the beginning, using an older film camera she had inherited from her mother and which she loaded and unloaded in the workshop storage room she had converted for that purpose. She photographed each car on arrival, the condition of the exterior, the state of the glass, the visible chassis markings, and the delivery documentation taped to each windshield. She did this because her father asked her to, and she did it thoroughly because thoroughness was a quality she had absorbed growing up in a workshop where the difference between a competent repair and a proper one was always a detail noticed versus a detail ignored. The photographs were dated, labeled in her handwriting, and stored in a binder that lived in the locked drawer of the filing cabinet beside Silas's desk. When the storage fee went unpaid in the first month, Silas mailed an invoice. When it went unpaid in the second month, he mailed a certified letter and kept the return receipt. When it remained unpaid at the end of the third month, he sent the formal notice of lien proceedings that his modified contract required. Victoria's office received it, logged it, and filed it in a category labeled Low Priority Correspondence, vehicles of negligible value. No one called. No one responded. No one drove out to inspect what was accumulating in Briar Glen. Silas kept the receipts, kept the records, and kept his silence, because he was operating on a timeline that had nothing to do with how quickly Victoria Blackthorne wanted him to surrender. Beneath the floor liner of the sixth car, pressed flat between the carpet pad and the floor pan inside an oilcloth wrapping that had held for decades, June found a small black and white photograph showing 20 cars lined in 3 rows before a large industrial building. On the back, in handwriting that would later be identified as the same hand that wrote on the sealed envelope, 20 were made, none were permitted to be seen, and none were ever supposed to return. The name Aurelius Motor Atelier appeared in fewer than a dozen published references across the entire span of American automotive history. A mention in the margin of a trade journal from 1957, a single line in a collector's registry out of print for 40 years, and a footnote in an academic paper on mid-century prototype design that described the company as a short-lived independent atelier that ceased operations before public release of its primary model series. Silas had encountered the name once before, years earlier, during his time doing restoration work for a Philadelphia auction house, in a conversation with an archivist who had said the Aurelius story was one of those histories that had been so completely absorbed by corporate consolidation that almost nothing documentary survived. He had not thought about it again until the badge on the sixth car confirmed what the chassis stamps had been suggesting since the first delivery. Edwin Aurelius had been an engineer before he was an entrepreneur, a man who spent the early 1950s convinced that the American luxury car had never been built to its actual potential, that every production grand tourer on the market was a commercial compromise dressed in expensive upholstery, and that a properly engineered car built without those compromises would do something the market had not yet shown it could do. He assembled a small team, secured independent funding, leased a facility outside Philadelphia, and began building what he called the Dominion Series. 20 cars, each unique in certain specifications, different compression ratios, different suspension tuning, different interior configurations, but all sharing the same hand-formed aluminum body, the same twin-cam engine architecture, the same sequential chassis numbering from Roman numeral 1 to Roman numeral 20. The plan was to produce a limited presentation run and use the response to secure manufacturing investment for a production version. The presentation never happened. In the spring of 1959, Aurelius filed for bankruptcy under circumstances that bore the particular pattern of a company outmaneuvered rather than merely outlasted. The assets of Aurelius Motor Atelier were acquired through a subsidiary of what was then called Northern Continental Industrial Holdings, a company that through a series of mergers across the following 3 decades had become the foundational entity from which Blackthorne Automotive Holdings emerged. The official record stated that the Dominion series prototypes had been disassembled and scrapped. The official record was wrong. Hollis Wade had been the long-term inventory manager at Blackthorn's primary storage facility in eastern Pennsylvania before Victoria's restructuring initiative eliminated his position. He was 67 years old, retired to a house on the outskirts of Briar Glen, and when Silas drove to his door and showed him photographs of chassis stamps on a phone screen, Hollis stood on his porch for a long time without speaking. He had known about a sealed warehouse section, known it contained vehicles categorized as legacy acquisitions, protected from routine disposition under instructions dating back to Victoria's father's tenure. He had not known the specifics of what those vehicles were, but he knew that when Victoria ordered the facility cleared as part of the consolidation program, the briefing she received described the contents only as outdated test units with no commercial value, a briefing prepared without anyone actually opening the sealed section. Hollis had spent 31 years at that facility and had raised the question of the sealed section twice during his tenure, once to a regional manager who told him the matter was above his level, and once in a written report that was acknowledged and never answered. He had not raised it a third time. He had learned, the way people learn things in large organizations, that certain questions had costs attached to them that were not worth paying on someone else's behalf. He had retired with the knowledge of what was in that section sitting in him the way uncomfortable knowledge sits. Not forgotten, not acted on, simply carried. Hollis retrieved a storage ledger from a shelf in his spare room, a bound notebook tracking every item logged into that facility across his tenure. The last pages carried 20 entries, each with a chassis number and a storage location. Every number matched the sequence Silas had been documenting for months. On the final page, beneath the last entry, someone had added a note in a different hand. 3 words, "Do not release." Silas photographed every page of the ledger. Then he asked Hollis whether he would be willing to provide a written statement. Hollis said yes, without hesitation and without asking what it was for. Date end. 6 months into the storage agreement, Victoria Blackthorn had arrived at a conclusion that Silas Rowe was not a man experiencing increasing financial difficulty, but a man performing the appearance of it while doing something she had not yet identified, and this conclusion made her angrier than the original refusal had. She was not accustomed to opacity. Every person she had applied pressure to in her career had responded in one of 2 predictable ways. They either accelerated toward capitulation or they became loudly defiant, and loud defiance was easy to manage because it justified escalation and gave her legal team clear targets. Silas did neither. He continued to operate his reduced workshop, continued to file every document on time, continued to respond to her attorney's letters with brief, factual replies that contained no emotion and no openings. Victoria increased the pressure through channels that were individually defensible. A formal environmental review triggered by a complaint about fluid runoff, an anonymous query to the county building office about structural compliance, a meeting she arranged with the regional bank manager framed as a general discussion about commercial real estate, but which moved in its second half toward questions about specific properties on that corridor. She arrived at the shop one afternoon herself, wearing a white suit that was both a signal of confidence and a deliberate contrast to everything around her, and told Silas that what he was doing was not courage. It was a slow form of self-destruction, and that she had seen it before in men who would rather lose everything than admit they had run out of options. Silas listened the same way he always listened, fully, without interruption, without the jaw tightness that appears when someone is composing their response before the speaker has finished. Then he told her she might want to look more closely at what she was burying. Victoria assumed this was rhetorical. She was wrong, but she did not know that yet. By the 8th month, Silas had documented lien eligibility on the first 6 cars and filed the required paperwork with the County Vehicle Authority. Nathaniel Graves, Victoria's general counsel, reviewed the filing summary and sent her a memo stating that the company faced a procedural deadline on vehicles it had not retrieved, and that because the relevant contract addendum had been executed with facially valid terms, the company's legal position was weaker than it should have been. Victoria asked him what it would cost to retrieve the vehicles. Graves said the transport and associated filing costs on 6 cars would come to roughly $4,000. Victoria said the cars were worth less than that and told him to have the asset disposition team execute written abandonment notices for any vehicles in the storage agreement assessed at below $5,000. The asset team reviewed the company's own internal assessments, all based on surface condition documented when the vehicles had been moved out of the sealed warehouse, none reflecting any examination of the components, chassis provenance, or manufacturing details Silas had spent months cataloging. They generated the abandonment notices. Victoria signed them. Silas received copies within the week and filed them alongside the lien documentation in a folder labeled with the date and the words "completed transfer, first 6. Nathaniel had sent Victoria a separate memo recommending they pause all vehicle deliveries pending a full review of the storage agreement terms. Victoria replied that she was not going to let her legal team be paralyzed by a contract dispute over scrap. He had warned her twice before that, and twice before she had moved forward without adjusting course. And he was beginning to understand, with the clarity of a lawyer who had spent 14 years watching a client's judgment operate under pressure, that her decisions in this matter were no longer being made on the basis of commercial logic. They were being made on the basis of something more personal and therefore more dangerous. He documented his objections in writing, the way a lawyer documents things when he suspects he will need the record later, and then he followed his client's instructions because that was his function, and the deliveries continued. Silas, operating on the other side of the same silence, continued to keep his notebooks, continued to have June photograph every new arrival, and continued to wait. Freighter. When the 20th car arrived on the morning of day 365, Victoria had come in person because she wanted to watch the end of the thing. She had run a version of this approach before, not with cars and not with a storage agreement, but with the underlying mechanism, which was the accumulation of small, sustained pressure until a person's capacity to absorb it was exhausted. She had run it successfully in 4 property acquisitions and 2 supplier contract disputes. The difference in those cases was that the people in question had not been documenting anything. When she presented Silas with the delivery confirmation for the final car, she had added a clause to the standard form, a statement that the vehicles covered under the storage agreement had all been delivered, that Blackthorn Automotive had no further claim or interest in them, and that the responsibility for their disposition rested entirely with the property owner. She considered this her cleanup. She had her attorney witness it. What Silas found when he lifted the tarp on the 20th car that evening was a vehicle in a different state of preservation than the 19 that preceded it. The body showed surface corrosion, but the underlying metal was sound, the mechanicals were seized but complete, and the interior, though dried and cracked in the upholstery, retained all of its original components, including the instrument cluster, the center console, and a shallow tray beneath the passenger side floor mat that contained, wrapped in oilcloth, a package of documents. The package included engineering drawings signed by Edwin Aurelius, a numbered list of all 20 chassis with their individual specification variances, and a legal agreement dated 1959 that assigned intellectual property rights for the Dominion Series powertrain technology to an independent trust, a trust that had never been dissolved and whose existence had apparently not been disclosed in the asset purchase that transferred the Aurelius holdings to the Blackthorn predecessor company. There was also a personal letter from Edwin Aurelius, addressed to no one by name and to every future owner by implication, describing plainly and without flourish what had been taken from him, and asking that if any of the 20 cars survived, they be allowed to carry his name. The bank's final notice arrived the following morning, a formal 30-day warning before accelerated foreclosure proceedings on the property mortgage. Silas called Eleanor, who had anticipated this and had already spoken with the auction house's financial partners about a pre-auction collateral arrangement against the vehicles whose ownership was already legally confirmed. The advance was enough to cover the outstanding mortgage balance. Silas accepted it and signed the collateral agreement that afternoon, protecting the land without pledging the full collection. Completing the legal transfer on the remaining 14 vehicles took 11 days after the final notification deadlines passed. Blackthorn Automotive sent no response to any of the formal notices, made no retrieval request, issued no protest. The abandonment documentation Victoria had signed months earlier covered the bulk of the fleet. The final 6 were transferred under the lien provisions of the original contract addendum, processed through the county authority, and confirmed without objection. The county examiner who reviewed the file later told his supervisor it was the cleanest lien-to-title conversion he had processed in 11 years. Every required notification sent on time, every deadline respected, every signature obtained at the correct stage. The person who had executed the process had clearly understood exactly what was required and had done each step in the correct sequence without any apparent urgency, which was either the work of a very careful attorney or a very patient man. It was both, in a way. The attorney who had advised Silas on the addendum language had charged $500 for 2 hours of consultation, which Silas had considered a considerable expense at the time, and which had since proved to be the most consequential $500 he had ever spent. On the 12th day, Silas arranged all 20 cars in the sequence Edwin Aurelius had photographed them in 1959, using June's photograph as his reference. He stood at the far end of the row and looked at them for a long time without taking a picture, without calling anyone. Then he went inside and told Eleanor the collection was complete and she could begin the process. The following morning, a flatbed transport bearing the Vail and Wexler logo appeared on the county road. Victoria Blackthorn received the auction announcement by certified mail before noon. The complete Aurelius Dominion series, 20 verified prototypes, to be offered at closed bidder international auction in 14 days. Victoria arrived at the property that same afternoon, without scheduling, without calling ahead, and without the particular composure she had maintained through every prior visit. She was not shouting. She was too controlled for that. But the quality of her stillness had changed, and the people who knew her well, including Nathaniel Graves, who had driven separately and arrived 3 minutes behind her, understood that the stillness was no longer the absence of feeling but the suppression of it, which was a different thing and a more fragile one. She declared that the vehicles were property of Blackthorn Automotive and that any documentation Silas believed he had accrued was the product of a misunderstanding her legal team would correct. Silas let her finish. Then he opened the folder he had been keeping on his desk for 8 months and placed its contents on the hood of the nearest car, one document at a time. The storage contract, the original addendum with the abandoned property provisions, his edits in black ink, her signature at the bottom, every invoice, dated and stamped, the certified letter receipts bearing the Blackthorn corporate address as the confirmed delivery point, the lien filing confirmations from the county authority, the abandonment notices bearing Victoria's own signature on 6 vehicles, the written delivery confirmation on the final car, signed and witnessed, stating that Blackthorn Automotive had no further interest in the stored vehicles. The title transfer documents for all 20 cars, processed and confirmed. Nathaniel reviewed them without rushing, page by page, and his face, through that reading, communicated nothing except the controlled neutrality of a lawyer who has just confirmed his worst professional assessment. He told Victoria that the documents were properly executed and that the chain of custody was complete. Victoria looked at him the way she looked at people who provided information she had not asked for. She offered Silas $500,000 for the collection. He said no. She offered $2 million. He said no. She offered $5 million and told him to name the additional conditions. He took his time before answering. He told her what he wanted: public documentation of the Aurelius history. The engineers who worked on the Dominion series identified and credited in any institutional presentation, the collection exhibited in a public venue, and a formal Blackthorn acknowledgement that the design innovations in the cars were the work of Edwin Aurelius and his team, not of the Blackthorn family's engineering legacy. Victoria told him that what he was asking for amounted to a public retraction of her family's history. Silas told her that what she was asking for amounted to paying to undo what she had done. The legal threat came the next afternoon. A letter from a second firm asserting the storage agreement had been improperly structured. Eleanor Vale, copied on the letter, responded through her own counsel the following morning with one sentence: "Should this matter enter litigation, the complete contents of the 20th prototype's documentation compartment will be introduced as evidence and will become part of the public record." Nathaniel read that response sitting in his car in the parking structure beneath Blackthorn headquarters, and sat there for 11 minutes before going up to tell Victoria that the litigation strategy was not viable and that the auction would proceed. Victoria said nothing when he finished. The international registration for the auction closed 48 hours before the event date, with confirmed bidders from 4 countries and 2 museum acquisition funds. The opening bid was set at $8 million. The auction was held in a restored industrial building that had once been a machine works. Its exposed steel construction and the way light moved across its concrete floors matching the atmosphere of the things it was being asked to contain. The 20 Aurelius prototypes stood in 3 rows positioned according to the 1959 photograph, each one lit from above by adjustable spots that revealed the body contours without softening the evidence of age. Behind each car, on a simple panel mounted at eye level, was a printed sheet: chassis number, engineering specifications, name of the prototype engineer responsible for that unit's specific variations, date of manufacture, and provenance history from the Aurelius facility through 6 decades of storage to the Briar Glen property. June Rose photographs formed the core of the conservation record displayed alongside every unit. Silas sat in the last row of chairs, wearing a dark jacket that fit him the way a suit fits someone who does not wear suits often but knows how to put one on. Eleanor opened the bidding at $8 million. The opening was clean. 3 bidders moved through the first rounds quickly, and the room, which had been quiet in the particular way rooms are quiet when everyone present understands what they are watching, stayed that way as the numbers climbed. 9 million, 10.5, 12, 14.8, 16. At 16 million, one of the 3 initial bidders withdrew and the pace slowed, each increment requiring longer deliberation, each pause carrying the weight of institutions committing to figures that would need to be explained and justified to boards and donors and acquisition committees for years afterward. 18.2, 19. A private collector submitted $19.5 million by phone. The National Automotive Museum Acquisition Fund, represented by a woman who had not moved from her seat or changed her expression since the bidding opened, submitted $20 million along with a written addendum. a public commitment that the collection would remain intact, would be exhibited without admission restriction during a designated number of days per year, and that all identification panels would carry the Aurelius name and the names of the engineers who built the cars. Eleanor looked at Silas. He nodded once. The hammer fell. The room did not explode into applause. It released, which is different, the sound of collective held breath becoming ordinary air. Victoria Blackthorne sat 4 rows forward from Silas, beside Nathaniel Graves, and did not move when the room around her shifted. After the auction ended and Eleanor was managing the formal close, Victoria found Silas near the exit and told him he had not beaten her. He had only found something she had not known was there. Silas told her that she had known enough to throw them away, and that he had only known enough not to. After the auction fees, the legal costs, the outstanding loan on the property, the advance repayment, and the taxes, what remained was less than the headline figure, but considerably more than Silas Rowe had ever held at one time in his life, and he deployed it with the same methodical patience he had brought to every other decision across the previous year. He paid off the mortgage in full. He repaired the workshop roof, replaced the equipment he had sold during the difficult months, and rebuilt the customer bay with room for 3 vehicles instead of 1. He hired 4 mechanics, 2 of whom were men in their late 50s and early 60s who had worked in Blackthorne's maintenance division before the restructuring eliminated their department. He established a training program for restoration work focused on vehicles from the 1940s through the 1960s, partnering with a technical college 2 counties over whose automotive program had been underfunded for years. He created a scholarship in Edwin Aurelius's name. He donated June's complete photographic documentation of the collection, every dated, labeled print, to the museum that purchased the cars, where it became part of the permanent exhibition record. He did not move. He did not buy a larger house. He did not acquire anything that could not be traced to a specific use. At Blackthorne Automotive, the board's internal review concluded that the company had suffered a preventable loss attributable to decisions made at the executive level without adequate legal due diligence and in response to what the report described as a personal rather than a commercial objective. Victoria was asked to step down from the chief executive role. There were no criminal proceedings. There was no catastrophic public collapse to speak of. The consequence that mattered, the one she had never calculated into any scenario in the year, she spent applying pressure to a single-story workshop in Briar Glen, was the one that played out in the month following her departure, when every significant industry publication that covered the Aurelius auction included a line about the company that had not recognized what it owned, and in each one the name beside that characterization was hers. A year after the auction, Silas and June drove to the museum on a Saturday morning when it opened. The 20 cars stood exactly as they had been arranged, under the same cool white light, still carrying their scratches and their original paint and the particular visual texture of things that have existed through time without being made to look otherwise. June read the placard beside the first car and was quiet for a while. She asked her father if he ever felt grateful to Victoria Blackthorne for what she had done. Silas looked down the line of 20 cars the same way he had looked at them that afternoon in the Briar Glen yard, when everything they carried was still unknown to anyone but him, and he said no, but he was grateful that she had never bothered to look. They walked back through the exit together, and the last thing visible through the museum's rear window as they left was the first car in the Aurelius row, its silver badge catching light the same way it had caught the light the day the 20th car arrived. On the day, the last insult turned itself, quietly and without ceremony, into everything.
Its power will wear off within a few short years. Though it's good enough against boneheads like this one. Anyway, just consider it an ace up your sleeve. The young boys these days know no manners. Fear not. Teach them a lesson with your new spell.
Ah! No! No, bro, no. Oh no. Oh my god, bro. That's fucked up.